Wanted to welcome you all to the Cyber Incident Survival Guide, the centrality of communications strategy and governance in a new era of SEC enforcement. As the title suggests, we'll be discussing the SEC's disclosure rules and what those rules mean for strategic and crisis communications before, during, and after an incident. This presentation is a co-production between FTI Consulting and Cooley. And just to begin, my name is Matt Seidel, and I'm a Senior Director on FTI's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Crisis Communications team. I'd love to have my panelists introduce themselves briefly. We'll go Garrett, Sarah, Mike, Dave.
Yeah, hi, I'm Garrett Nisikowski. I sit on FTI Consulting's governance and activism team. So I work with companies to draft disclosures, largely proxies and inclusive 8Ks, and help companies engage with investors in financial and ESG matters, of which cyber is arguably to the top of the list recently.
I'm Mike Legan. I'm a partner in Cooley's Cyber Data Privacy Group. I focus primarily on cybersecurity preparedness and response and the privacy issues that come out of that. Work mostly with public companies, which obviously leads to a great deal of relationships with our public companies team here at Cooley as well to sort of prepare companies for these new SEC rules and communications and issues that arise in responding to cybersecurity incidents.
Hi, my name is Dave Nebetta. I'm a partner at Cooley also. Been working on data breaches since about 2005, so have seen the progression and evolution of these breaches. What we're going to talk about today, the SEC rule and enforcement, really has impacted the field quite a bit, and we're looking forward to highlighting some of the communication challenges that arise out of the new rule and its implications.
And I'm Sarah Sendek. I'm a managing director on our cybersecurity, on FTI's cybersecurity and data privacy communications team. We support organizations across all sectors in incident response and preparedness efforts as it relates to cyber incidents, whether it be ransomware, insider threat, data privacy, national security, nation state actors, that sort of thing. Also, before I came to FTI, I was previously the first director of public affairs at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So I also have a background and familiar with some of these rulemaking processes and rules coming down the pipeline as it relates to government.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I do want to get started. But what I'd like to get started with is to specifically outline our sort of theory of the case here. And it may be no surprise coming from a crisis communications person, but we'd like to assert that the SEC cyber rule and SEC enforcement has enhanced the mission critical nature of communications, both pre-incident, during an incident, and after an incident. In light of this, public companies should have a strategic and crisis communications plan when thinking about cybersecurity crises, and that plan should contemplate how you're communicating publicly about security and as well across other domains. Finally, your response to an incident and your prep for an incident is going to have an impact on your governance structure. So with that, we're going to assume a little bit of prior knowledge on the rule, but I do want to pass it off to the folks at Cooley first to sort of set the agenda and frame the conversation. What are sort of the headlines from the rules that our guests should be aware of?
Sure. So, again, we assume everybody sort of had some familiarity with the new rules. They really fall into two buckets. There's one bucket that's coming up for a lot of companies right now, which is their 10K disclosures around their governance structures and risk management program and processes. So what they have to describe around their risk management program, which can include sort of their preparations for responding to incidents and mitigating the threats coming from that, as well as the new 8K disclosures, which came into effect towards the end of December around disclosing material cybersecurity incidents. And we've already seen a number of 8Ks get filed just in the past few weeks on this issue. And it's really triggered a lot of thought around, how we communicate in the context of an incident, given the very short time frame. So you've got 4 days from the determination that it is a material cybersecurity incident. It's not 4 days from discovery, and it's 4 business days from that determination. But you have to make that decision within a not unreasonable amount of time. So thinking through what those issues are, how to contemplate them, knowing that you actually have to go out to market, go public with this information, really a lot sooner than a lot of companies would have aimed to do previously. So, Dave, I know you had a couple extra thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think tying it to the communication challenges, right? This is a transparency statute, like data breach notification laws for personal information. It requires and mandates some sort of reporting, but here the reporting is public day one. If you do an 8K, it's out there, and that creates an entire new set of communication challenges. That many normal data breaches involving personal information may not have any publicity associated with them, but this is a guarantee of publicity. As Michael mentioned, it's also on a short time frame and a short fuse. So we have to think about how that's going to happen, whether you're ready at the beginning of the breach, if you can get a communication strategy ready in real time, which is difficult, although the FTI team has done it many times, as have we, but better to be prepared. And then the final consideration that we're going to get into a little bit is how threat actors might leverage some of the timing issues and some of the publicity issues to help them with extortion demands and ransomware attacks. So we'll get into all these rules, but all these issues. But at the end of the day, the takeaway is communications, because of the rule, are much more important for companies to consider ahead of time.
Thank you so much, Mike and Dave. And Sarah, David sort of touched on the communications challenges associated with these rules. Can you give us your perspective on what those challenges are and how this should inform a public company's strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Dave's point, just in this short time we've seen the rule take effect, we've seen and can expect that this rule is going to fundamentally change any organization's communications strategy. We now have an 8K in most cases that's going to be driving any communications plan. I think to Dave and Mike's point that this may become public much sooner, if ever, than before, which will kind of lead to a domino effect of internal and external communications. If you're filing an 8K, what kind of communications have taken place across your organization? Are your employees aware? Is your board aware? You don't want any internal communications to be the first time they see it through an 8K. Same thing with customers and clients. As soon as this 8K comes out, it's a very public statement. And then you're going to have a lot of incoming questions. What's next? Was my data affected? Are your systems safe? Not only that, it could change your threat negotiations. You're kind of putting your cards out on the table early on as you may be still in negotiations with a threat actor. Your system still might not be secure. So there's a lot of different considerations when you're having to make these quick decisions to go out in a very, very public platform. And these considerations need to be taken into account now. They need to be built into any existing crisis communications plan, and organizations, companies should be practicing these new crisis communications plans now, understanding who's making the decision to file the 8K and what order of communications you're going to have to push out on a very constrained time frame.
Great. And Garrett, a lot of this conversation is happening from the context of the investing public and the health of public companies. Right off the bat, what do we need to be keeping in mind here?
Yeah, just fundamentally, investors hate uncertainty, right? And that's whether we're talking about financial guidance or a cyber breach or cyber incident. And so Mike mentioned the 4 business day period and how it's kind of expediting how fast companies are reporting on an incident. And oftentimes forcing them to file an 8K with an incomplete understanding of the extent of the incident. And so you have to kind of expect that investors are not going to respond well to an 8K filing that doesn't have a lot of context to it, and thinking through the 8K that you're about to file from an outside investor lens is an important exercise to go through before you finally submit it. A lot of times we're working on drafting these 8Ks and we're so involved behind the scenes, and you don't take that last second to have an outside perspective or someone who's not as familiar with the incident take a look at it and say, okay, how will an investor who doesn't know what's going on with this respond to this 8K? And just taking that kind of extra look at it to, at a minimum, expect investor questions or even potentially improve the quality of the 8K is an important step to take.
Just one point to add to that. These 8Ks can cause the stock value to, of course, drop, right? If investors see that there's a breach and they're concerned, that may cause stock value by itself to go down, irrespective of what's actually happened on the ground, right? So if you go out too early without enough information, you may be causing undue I'll call it panic, but trading or dumping of stocks, which could bring the stock value down. And if you wait too late, of course, the opposite happens. So it's a very much a fine balance between getting out with enough information to be meaningful to investors without over alarming the market as to what's going on. And again, I don't know if there's unintended consequences, but this 4-day reporting period the SEC imposed kind of creates, in my opinion, and maybe even enhances some of the uncertainty associated with these data breaches if you don't have enough time to figure out exactly what happened.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to bear in mind there, and this all goes back to the preparation and Dave's good point around, it's a fine line between too early and too late, and all of this stuff will be judged with 2020 hindsight. But in terms of that communications plan, it's also, are you setting a precedent? If you go out and say, hey, we've had this thing, it may or may not be material, we don't really know, but we're just putting in our marker now, does that set a precedent for you on a go forward basis that investors will always expect you to do that? So if you don't do that in the future, if you hold a little bit longer, wait till it's actually material, right? So all of these considerations really need to come into play from a strategic standpoint. And, I think this is our sort of overall message here is you don't want to be thinking through these things in the moment. You want to have some of these, some of the processes and mechanisms in place and have thought through some of these issues before the breach happens so that you're not trying to come up with it on the fly.
Agreed, Mike. And I know we're going to be getting into some of that pre-breach preparation pretty shortly. But before we get there, I really wanted to zoom in a little bit. Mike and Dave, you both talked about materiality. I think we've all heard that word, heard the considerations bandied about quite a bit over the last few months in response to these rules. But and we all know about quantitative considerations, right? But what are we really here to talk about today when we're thinking about what's relevant to constructing a communication strategy based on the idea of materiality?
Yeah, on materiality, the SEC has made clear that quantitative losses are relevant in the analysis. How much money is the company going to lose because of the data breach, right? But they've also made clear that qualitative impacts are relevant, which ties into reputational harm, loss of goodwill, loss of customers, regulatory scrutiny, all of these things that happen when a breach goes public or is threatened to go public if a threat actor is making that threat, right? And so this is where, again, communications are key. So I think what we're already seeing is that communication teams are coming in and helping with the materiality discussion and analysis because they have the insight to know what the true impact reputationally it would be, brand would be, customer relations would be ahead of time. So the communication focus here is not just on what to say, but the communication folks are actually helping to figure out what the qualitative impact might be to a data breach. And I think that's a different role, I think, for communication people sometimes to be predictive in that fashion. And but I think it's going to be crucial here because a lot of these breaches, quantitatively, arguably don't have much of an impact. It's the quantitative or qualitative, the customer loss, the loss of trust that can really have a longer term impact and a longer tail. So now we're going to be in a situation where not only is the team on the communication side helping with that materiality decision, they're helping craft a communication plan that will hopefully make the incident and the impact of it not material, right? So you can actually affect the materiality of the incident with a good communication plan and actually mitigate some of the harm if you're doing it properly.
And for Sarah and Garrett, this is a pretty broad question, but can you talk at a high level about what that plan might look like? Sarah, maybe you take kind of press, employees, and customers, and Garrett, you can take it from the board and investor perspective.
Yeah, I think to Dave's point, having good communications response is kind of key in these incident response, especially in those very early phases of minimizing the impact and the reputational damage to a company. Customers and clients, internal communications, media want to see that you're being transparent, that you're being open and not kind of stonewalling or hiding the ball. But it's also important to remember that in these cyber incidents especially, there's a lot of unknowns in the early phases. And so under these new rules, if you're going out early to say that we have a cyber incident and you're saying it on a very public scale, you might be limited in what kind of details you're sharing. I think that was Garrett's point earlier. It might be frustrating to see, we've had a cyber incident and very other limited details. And that's where we try to help our clients when they're building these communications plans to have as much information and be as armed with as much material as possible to kind of handle the incoming that naturally comes after you publicly report an incident. So if your customers are coming to you and your clients are coming to you with all sorts of questions about the impact on their own businesses, on their own data, on their own security of their systems, you want to have a plan for how you're communicating that, showing that you're being responsive and trying to convey the facts of the situation without getting ahead of anything, without saying something that may turn out to not be true later on. That's kind of one of the biggest reputational risks for companies is getting out ahead of the facts in a cyber incident, saying something that they have to walk back. That's a lot harder than just saying, hey, we're in the early phases, we're trying to figure this out and we'll share more. So making sure you have that kind of comprehensive strategy, how you're going to handle all those incomings once this becomes public on a very large scale. Same with media incomings, how are you handling those? Who's your central point of contact making the decisions about what you're saying? Are you plugged in with the security team to understand the facts as they're evolving, as we're learning more? Staying close to your legal team to not get ahead of any of that. So that's kind of some of the initial considerations as we're putting these plans into place. But we like to tell our clients to be as armed with as much information as possible. Make sure they know who's picking up the phone, who's going to be on the front lines having to answer these questions, and make sure they're trained and understand what they are saying, what they are sharing, and how you need to escalate questions that you can't answer in those initial days and weeks. But Garrett, I'll toss it to you if you have anything for the board and investor level.
No, I just think from the investor perspective, there's usually two questions. And the first is, how significant is the incident? And again, as we've covered, a lot of times you don't know the answer to that when you're being asked that question. But the second is how big of an impact is there on business? And that actually goes to a lot of what Sarah and Dave were talking about, in that if you can go to an investor and say, look, we don't know the full extent of the incident, but we've talked to our top 20 customers, we've talked to our top 20 suppliers, we've talked to all of our employees, and they're on board, we have plans in place to continue business operations. All of that matters, and that can ease investor concerns. And so you might not be able to tell an investor the extent of an incident right off the bat, but if you can tell them the plans you have in place to maintain your relationship with other stakeholders, it's really important. And the same goes with media, honestly, because investors read media just as much as anyone else. And so your ability to navigate headlines and social media actually impacts investor sentiment as well.
One other thing to know, and it kind of goes to what you were saying, Garrett, and Michael brought it up too, the idea of a marker type of AK when you're not sure about materiality quite yet. I'm not sure of the AKs that I've seen at least filed that any of them have said as what's required under the rule is you need to report the material impact or reasonably likely material impact of an incident. Most of the AKs I'm seeing are more along the lines of, we've had an incident, there may be a material impact, we'll get back to you later, effectively, right? So I, kind of a question to Garrett, doesn't that cause confusion in the market? What is an investor supposed to do potentially with a placeholder AK? Should they be dumping the stock because it's going to be bad? Should they be holding? How does this strategy play out from an investor point of view? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's tough. And I mean, the other point, we'll get into it later, is like there's different types of investors, and investors have different time horizons. And so for investor relations department, this is something that we work with our clients a lot with in these incidents, is understanding who's on the other end of things. If you have an investor with a 3-month time horizon, they plan on selling stock in 3 months anyway, the second you file that 8K, they're probably out of the stock, because they're not worth the wait and see time period to see how the rest of this plays out. They were going to sell in 3 months anyway, and so what's the point in waiting, right? And I think the important part here is understanding your shareholder base and understanding kind of how they're going to respond to this. And I think you can actually craft disclosure or reach out to them after your 8K is filed based off of the type of shareholder that you're talking to. And not every shareholder is going to respond to the same 8K the same way, right? And I think that's just kind of passive investors, active investors, everyone has a different time horizon. I think all of that comes into play here, partially in how you draft the 8K, but definitely in any follow-up conversations that you have with your investors.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing is, and you mentioned a lot of good things there in terms of the different types of investors. And one thing that's come up in a number of the breaches that I've worked on of late is they'll occur, very close in time to the investor relations call, right? An earnings call that they have to do. And so how equipped are the folks who are on the earnings call to be able to talk to these issues, right? So I'm sort of curious around that aspect, but then I also just wanted to highlight something. We've been focused on sort of how the company is communicating out these issues. But the other thing to bear in mind is, and Dave alluded to this before, with the threat actors sort of using these tools to help pressure companies into paying and everything else. These threat actors have their own sort of media relationships and PR arms in some cases, right? So you're not always in charge of what information is going out into the market. And so sometimes it's understanding that, we can only put out what we know to be the case. The threat actors might also be putting out additional information around either the scope of the attack or the scope of data that they have, et cetera. So, being able to react to that and understand that, I think, Garrett, Sarah, I don't know about sort of your thoughts on that, but I think those are some really challenging issues in this space when you can only talk to what you know, but there's other information out there in the media sphere.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike. And I think we talked about this previously, but the threat actor is also building these new requirements into their own strategy and have taken steps. We saw last month the threat actor was a little early on the actual rule going into effect, but went and filed their own SEC complaint against one of their victim organizations for having not complied with the rules as the threat actor understood them. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account as well. I think to Dave's point earlier, we've seen a lot of companies pushing out 8Ks so far without actually making the determination of materiality, which seems to be setting some sort of precedent, companies erring on the side of caution and pushing on an 8K, whether or not they've determined any materiality. And I think for companies moving forward, we're still in the very early phases. Is that going to be what they're measured against in the public space, in the media and investor, opinion? Are they going to be measured against how quickly they filed the 8K at this point, since we're seeing companies doing that already? And what happens to the first one that waits and doesn't file as quickly?
So I think we're surrounding the same issue, but the concern from my perspective is if you go out too early, cause a stock change or stock value drop, and then you find out later that the breach wasn't as bad as you thought it was initially, right? And this happens quite frequently for data breach responders. Everyone on this call probably has been on a breach where it looked like the sky was falling, and then you do a little forensics, your communication plan ready to go, and you find out, oh, well, they didn't actually get to the crown jewels, right? We saw this when Europe, under GDPR, came on with their breach notification laws, where basically European companies, any little tick around a potential issue around personal information being breached was being reported to all of the data protection regulators in Europe, to the point where one of the data protection regulators publicly said at a conference, over-reporting is just as bad as under-reporting. In fact, if you are over-reporting and there's low risk of harm to the individuals, that suggests that your security program and your security controls are inadequate because you don't have the ability to assess risk appropriately, right? So one thing people, in terms of going out early, are maybe not truly considering is that there's a downside to that as well, right? If you go out with information that's incomplete or omits information or is uncertain and it causes stock value to drop, that can be, in terms of investor SEC activity or investor lawsuits, just as bad as going out late and not giving them an opportunity to make decisions based on what's actually happening on the ground. So again, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of thing. We'll see how it plays out. And I think Garrett, your point about investors and how they react to like the placeholder is going to be really important. You know, maybe they don't react. Maybe it doesn't cause anything that is problematic, and therefore it's okay. But if they do react or overreact to something that is a false positive, there's a downside to that as well.
I think it's also, you know, one of the other things to bear in mind here that wasn't always the case before these new rules was the tie-in between those customer communications, the stakeholder communications, and the public disclosures to the market, right? So a lot of companies have, you know, blogs or the things that they put up, and when they're having, you know, a publicly known instance or incident where there's some of their systems are down or what have you, right? Those are now going to be seen. You know, those are statements to investors. So are all of those things sort of stitched up? Are they couched in the right way to make sure that you're not creating false impressions there, that you're, you know, whatever you're saying out into the public is accurate, and you're not creating either a false impression that everything's okay or putting out more information there than you should be or things that aren't confirmed yet, right? So I think it's just a really difficult dance to try and it goes back to the materiality point again of, you know, we're trying to do what we can to make sure we don't lose customers and that everybody is comfortable with the security of the systems and the operations of all these things. And we need to communicate with them, but knowing that those communications, even if they aren't put on the website, you have to assume that they will be made public in some way, shape, or form. Right. So, you know, taking that into account, I think is one of the challenging aspects that the FTI team here is very keyed in on and, you know, can help companies work through. But I think that's one where, you know, there's usually a difference between who's handling investor communications and who's handling the customer comms, and sort of getting all that stitched up is really critical.
Yeah, one point back to the threat actor comment that Michael made and how they're leverage things. I'm curious, Sarah and Garrett, you know, one motivating factor for reporting earlier is that there's a threat actor that's going to report something that, of course, may be even less accurate than what we know. It may be overstate the breach. It may be a lie. I mean, we've seen this many times in cyber extortion events where they overstate what they've taken or they make it seem much worse than it is. How do you see communication challenges coming about based on the threat actor and trying to maybe this idea of getting ahead of them, right? How does that play in your world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. And they certainly have been known to lie. They go to the media and try to kind of exaggerate. And I think that's to what I was saying earlier, you know, something to take into account, that this is going to be an additional tool in the threat actors toolbox in terms of extortion tactics and ways that they can try to pressure a victim organization to pay a ransom. I think in terms of preparing for that, we try when we come into these incidents to understand that there's all sorts of scenarios and tactics these threat actors can use, and we do what we call scenario planning and kind of try to build out like what are the worst things we think that a threat actor might try to do. You know, we've seen them not just through the 8K, but on a broader scale. They contact employees, they harass executives, they go to the media. So what are some of the things that we know threat actors try to do to leverage these payments? And how can we plan a kind of rapid response communications operation so that when we see these things coming through, we're able to get out and kind of control that narrative and control that message. But yeah, I think that's a common problem with threat actors, and this is just one additional tool that they'll be able to use moving forward, and something that we'll need to build that kind of scenario planning for, and understand that that's something that we have and we'll continue to see them do.
And Dave, I do think, you know, we talked about the timing and there's risk of going out too early and going out too late. And I don't think those are the only two considerations in terms of when you release your 8K. Maybe you're debating if you're ready or not to file an 8K, and you get a call from a reporter that a story's going out in the morning. Maybe you speed up your timeline for your 8K and you have enough information, but you're able to put out factual information before who knows what information is going out from the reporter. And so I think there's a lot of other factors that determine timing besides just is this too early and too late from the amount of information we have? And I think that's just one other factor to consider. There's a lot of variables at play.
So we're getting some good questions in, folks, and I want to start turning to some of those and address those. And I do want to also move into the pre-breach communications that I know that our organizations are working on. But first, so we have two questions on materiality and one question on Rule FD. From Paula, I want to start on Rule FD. Dave, Mike, can you take this one? Speak to Rule FD and the danger in treating various investors or customers differently.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that's really important, in particular if you're a smaller reporting company and maybe the new 8K rules don't apply to you until mid-June. You still might have a Reg FD issue, right? So where you've got an issue where you do need to inform the market of these things. So you might not have the same timing requirements, but this goes back to really the strategy and the communications plan, right? So are we communicating out with certain customers, but not others? Have we put things on a blog somewhere? Have we posted things to social media, right, that maybe not everybody has access to? So it's really understanding what all those different communications channels might be and what are we doing on each of those? And is that synced up, or is there different information available to different parties? And how can we make that more consistent? And this is really around, and we see this come up, time and again in incidents, and it's not, because people don't want to do the right thing. It's just because maybe the communications plan isn't as stitched up, and we'll get into this in sort of the pre-incident preparation. But you might have, as we just talked about, one group for investor relations, one group that's focused on, your B2B customers, another group focused on B2C, another group that's on social media, right? And they're all trying to react in real time. And your internal communications might be down for various different reasons, right? So you've got internal communications challenges. And so pulling all these things together and understanding, okay, have we tripped a wire where we actually have a full disclosure issue, where we actually need to go to the market for that reason, to make sure we have a good argument that everybody in the market has access to the same information, right, from an investor perspective. Because I think that's something that, can get lost in the weeds. And in particular, as companies, for those smaller reporting companies with the new 8K cybersecurity incident rules don't apply just yet, they might think they're sort of out of the woods on that issue, but it isn't necessarily the case.
And I think it's just important to note, as frustrating as it is, that in these situations, whether it's customers or investors, you're going to get some questions that you just can't answer, whether it's questions you don't have the answer to or questions that you haven't publicly disclosed the answer to yet, and can be very frustrating. But it's kind of the nature of these incidents, and so you just kind of have to roll with it. And if you have, throughout your engagements with your investors, just recognizing that it's not your last engagement with them. If you have recurring questions on the same topic from 5 or 6 investors, you can start to use that to craft subsequent disclosures or talk about it in earnings, which I think we'll get to. But there's always going to be, especially in the initial phase of these incidents, there's always going to be some questions that you can't answer, which is a frustrating part of this process, but it is kind of inherent.
Thanks, Garrett. And let's move into pre-breach communications, pre-breach training, and prep. And I want to talk a little bit about Andrew and Trish's questions as a little bit of an overlay to this conversation. So Andrew asks, do we have thoughts regarding proactive communications to shareholders, defining to them what our organization's definition of materiality is? That's question 1. Question 2, should we be talking to, in a preliminary fashion, vendors and other third parties before an 8K is filed to determine what materiality is? And so both of these strike me as elements of a plan, right? Of something we should be doing before an incident so that we're prepared to execute on our communications objectives during an incident. And with that, Dave, I wanted to pass it off to you. I know that you talk a lot, and we've discussed this about training security teams to communicate. What are some of the challenges you've seen, and what do you think? Why do you think this training is important?
Yeah, so this ties into, and Michael alluded to it a little bit earlier, sort of the idea of consistency and how you talk about security and what's happening at the organization across multiple channels, right? The SEC in the SolarWinds action they brought really the allegations against SolarWinds are premised on alleged misrepresentations or omissions associated with SolarWinds security, right? Whether that be in their financial statements, whether that be in security white papers that they put out publicly, blogs, but also importantly, they literally went into the organization using, I assume, discovery opportunities, and got messaging, Slack channel messages, emails, and other messages where the security team was talking about security at the organization in a way that was less than flattering, but in a very kind of informal way where they don't. I don't think they were expecting that their statements in Slack would be exhibit number one in an SEC action, right, where the CISO is being also named individually in that action, right? So how you talk about security and when you talk about it can and will be used against you by regulators and plaintiffs. And in my experience, and I think Michael's probably on the same page, oftentimes security professionals are communicating in a way that may be used against them or overstate problems or kind of say things that when taken out of context can be used against the organization, right? So we have actually, for a few clients now, been training security teams how to communicate effectively. One example that has come up in many cases is sort of the idea of heat maps. A lot of security teams and reporting up to the board and management use heat maps that show various risks. And inevitably, there are some issues that are in the red, right? And what does that mean, right, to an organization? A lot of times what that means is that there are things that need to be fixed and prioritized, but they're not imminent threats or they're not about to be exploited or breached because of those red heat map zones, right? So, but at the same time, you've got a board presentation that shows the red and it doesn't have any context around what that means, right? And so we're talking to security organizations saying, listen, if you're going to report something out as a problem, first of all, A, you should be doing that. That's your job. But B, provide the context that around that particular report so that should there be ever a data breach or a regulatory action, you can actually say, yeah, we were reporting this issue, but it was actually, we had compensating controls in place. The issue was a vulnerability and it was critical, but it was down, 4 layers of security, and it would have required a very sophisticated breach to even get to the vulnerability. So we're going to see more and more companies looking at that and making sure that the communications of security professionals are consistent, concise, correct, accurate, contextualized. We are developing what we're calling the 10 C's to help organizations and their teams talk about things professionally and in a way that helps them with their mission, but also doesn't get them into trouble.
Dave, I agree with all that, and I think it really points towards the evolving role of the CISO and then the importance of the CISO taking a leadership role in communications, both inside and outside an organization. And Sarah, I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that's also something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about at FTI. Under these new rules, one thing that the SEC didn't end up doing in the new reporting requirement is have a requirement to have a board member with cybersecurity experience, but there's a lot of other governance requirements, and it's really pushing these CISOs into these elevated roles, having to brief the board, having to make sure, or, what level of knowledge does the board and executive leadership have on your cybersecurity practices and investments? And, FTI did a survey of CISOs last year and found that CISOs feel increasing pressure to make things sound better than they actually are when briefing executive leadership, when briefing boards. They expressed that they really struggle to adequately communicate the risks that are there and what resources they need to do their jobs better. So one of the things that we're doing at FTI, we launched a program called Secure Your Seat, where we're working with CISOs to help them build better communications practices, learn to more effectively communicate risk to their board. We're helping them prepare board decks and do a media training of sorts. We have an advisory council made up of CISOs, lawyers, and other professionals in this space that kind of give this feedback and help to train other CISOs to do a better job in terms of the communications now that they're being brought into these higher level roles, and there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on the back end too. You know, as these companies are increasingly having cybersecurity incidents, there's going to be a lot more look back at what did you do, what did you have in place ahead of time. I know the SolarWinds investigation right now will probably set a lot of precedent as to what level of responsibility CISOs are going to have to take in the future. So something we're definitely thinking about and working on here.
One ripple effect that I'm seeing as of late is sort of the flip side of what Sarah was saying, right? CISOs have felt pressure to put a gloss over their reporting or kind of hold back. I think because CISOs are being named both in criminal actions and civil actions by the SEC, some of the reports I've been seeing have gone the other direction altogether, where they're being very stark about their security challenges and being very direct about the problems. And again, from a lawyer's point of view, you see the documents and you're saying, well, whoa, just we don't need to phrase it this way because it looks too alarmist. It looks, this is something that could be used against you. But I think these CISOs on some level are, I don't want to say fed up, because they feel they're personally on the front line of potential regulatory scrutiny, as well as even criminal activity in one case. So, it's interesting, these rules and the dynamics of the enforcement are really changing how the stakeholders within the organizations interact and react to each other internally. And so getting a handle on that is going to be very important, in my opinion, to make sure you have the right balance.
And I think this conversation segues us really nicely into a conversation about governance. And Sarah, I'm so glad that you noted the dropping of the board requirement. And I throw this question out to the whole group, and I think this will also give us a chance to talk about proactive communications to our investors. But do you think organizations will be able to self-regulate and kind of quote unquote get there on their own without having a cybersecurity expert on the board as defined as the SEC defines it?
I think so. I think it was partly a recognition of the fact that, there isn't actually that much cybersecurity expertise out there such that it could be on every single public company board. And I think we're going to see a little bit kind of like what we saw when Sarbanes-Oxley came out, right? There wasn't as much, financial and accounting literacy on boards before that. And then, sort of the goalpost moved and that became an expectation, right? So I think we're probably going to end up in the not so distant future with that being a really key element that boards look for in new members on a go forward basis. So, I think what you'll see is sort of the market move in that direction. But right now it's really, and this goes back to the communications piece we've been talking about, the education piece, the training piece. There's also an element there of making sure, as part of the governance feature, that oversight that the board needs to have, they need to receive education on these issues, right? And that can be, Dave and I do a ton of board training, audit committee training, education on cybersecurity issues, sort of how they oversee these things, how they understand the threat environment vis-a-vis their own company, right? So a lot of them haven't had to dive into the weeds of their policies, procedures, processes, things like that. So, I think this is it's an interesting area because but it's an opportunity also to build that. We were talking about the CISO and how they do reporting to the board. There's also a good opportunity there to build that relationship between the CISO and the board around those issues and show and to show the complexity of these issues that, cybersecurity is always sort of thought of as this cost center. All right, we're dumping a ton of money into it. The problem must be perfect and solved. And that just isn't the case, right? The goalposts are always moving in this regard. And so making sure that the board is up to date on that is critical. And I think we will, over the course of the next several years, see a lot more board expertise on boards. And, it will vary obviously by industries, right? Certain industries aren't going to be, this isn't going to be as critical as it is. And, if you are a publicly reporting cybersecurity company, then it might make more sense for you to have cybersecurity experts on your board versus, an industrial manufacturer or something like that.
And I think for those companies that, we may not have or add a cyber expert right away. There's, it's kind of a continuum between board expertise and board education. Like you mentioned, all the resources and education that boards should have available, or take a fresh look in terms of what they have available. I also think from a skills perspective, if you don't have a cyber expert per se, you should have, call it information technology or broader technology experience. And investors are increasingly looking, especially post universal proxy rules, for companies to define the skill sets that their board members have. So you can no longer just say, hey, here's Mike and he has cyber experience. You have to define what cyber experience is. And so for the boards that don't have a quote unquote cyber expert, defining what you mean by these 4 directors have technology experience or technology expertise will go a long way in showcasing that, okay, you might not have a cyber expert on the board today, but between the education and resources and everything that you're disclosing in your proxy and the defined skill of technology or information technology, you're able to put together a picture that shows you're proactively managing this.
Just stepping back on self-regulation and governance, I think about these rules, and on the surface, the SEC has said, of course, that this is about reporting to investors so they can make decisions. But what is really, in my opinion, happening? This is about changing behavior, ultimately. Whether it be the rule itself or whether it be the enforcement activity, it's kind of a playbook that the FTC has used in the past, right? You can read the tea leaves here by reading the SolarWinds action. You can read the tea leaves by looking at the comments around the SEC rule. They want this issue to be taken more seriously across the board when it comes to governance. They want to change behavior. Fairly or unfairly, they're putting pressure on CISOs to be leaders in that realm, but also expect management and the board to be players in this game, right? They're worried about material impacts and how security relates to those impacts and how risk is mitigated so that companies can achieve their objectives, not only to keep shareholders happy, but also, generally, right? A lot of this is coming out of the post-colonial pipeline ransomware attack. Sarah, we've got Cercia coming online around critical infrastructure. So think about the bigger picture here and what's really, in my opinion, behind this. Now, you can definitely debate whether regulators should be, legislating through enforcement. Probably not in many ways. But if you think of it from a perspective of not just the tactical, we need to report a data breach if it's material. Think about it from, we need to rejigger our governance structure and our risk management and assessment processes and how management is involved with the security function, so that not only are we ready to do the tactical thing, but we're actually hopefully achieving a better result from a security standpoint.
I think we'll need to schedule a separate webinar to talk about how this plays into all the other reporting requirements coming down the pipeline, whether from CISA or other agencies that are considering their own rules and how you're going to navigate that space.
Yeah, we're scratching the surface.
And I think this flows really nicely into the idea, like what we're really trying to communicate to the market. And Mike, it's talked about earlier, the annual reporting of risk mitigation procedures, tools, processes through the 10K. What do we, like, as a way to kind of put a bow on this conversation, what do we really think that investors want to see from organizations with respect to this issue? And not just because of the rule, but in general, as the cybersecurity landscape continues to evolve, how can we advise public companies how to better communicate to those communities what they are doing before an incident, way after an incident? Garrett, from a governance perspective, and I'll start with you, Garrett. What should organizations be doing now?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think cyber disclosures, we've mentioned the 10K, but I think they're going to evolve a lot in the proxy as well. And I think it's going to be similar to what we've experienced with climate disclosures over the past decade, where if you think back 10 years ago, many companies didn't even have formal oversight of climate or sustainability in any of their board committee charters. And now that's kind of like, I think everyone in the S&P 500 has it, and there's a million other disclosures around climate. I think we're going to head in a similar direction with cybersecurity. And you have BlackRock and Vanguard both put out pieces recently about how they've been engaging with portfolio companies and their boards on cybersecurity, kind of their expectations for boards and for management teams. Glass Lewis, one of the leading proxy advisors, just adopted a policy actually where for any company that experiences a material incident, they may recommend against directors the subsequent annual meeting if the company's proactive oversight and disclosures weren't adequate, or if the response and the disclosure of the response was not adequate. And I think that's kind of the answer, the Glass Lewis policy, is because for two things. One, the way Glass Lewis develops their policies is they survey a bunch of investors. And so that policy that they've landed on is actually the opinion of many institutional investors. But I think that's kind of the game, right? In that hopefully you don't experience an incident, but if you do, investors are going to A, expect you to have plans in place and have disclosed that you have those plans in place. And then B, if you do experience an incident, putting those plans into place and tying them to an outcome is going to be very important. And if not, it can lead to repercussions at the board level, because that's kind of where investors are taking this. The last thing I'll add, and then Mike, feel free to chime in, is BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have faced a lot of pressure on the way they've voted and the way they've pushed environmental and social issues at their portfolio companies. And they've supported a lot less initiatives or shareholder proposals on environmental and social topics this year. And I do think that cybersecurity is a very clear and easy topic for them to tie to financial materiality and say, we're going to engage with a lot of our portfolio companies on cybersecurity. And so in the fall outreach or passive outreach process that we lead our clients through, cybersecurity has been on the top of the agenda for a lot of our clients, because BlackRock wants to talk about it, Vanguard wants to talk about it, and it's important to our clients as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it really goes to the value of the company, right? If you talk about a lot of companies right now, that a lot of their value comes in their data or their IP or these other things that are really tied to their information systems and data warehouses, right? And so if they lose access to that, it goes to the underlying value of the company and its operations. And I think it's also a recognition, and it's something, Dave and I have been harping on for 17 years, whatever it is, right? That this is not an if, it's a when. Right, you could have the absolute best cybersecurity system in the world. You could still get breached, right? Social engineering is very effective, right? Somebody can still get into your system. So it's a recognition that you shouldn't be taking this position that we've got all these great security controls in place, so we don't really need to think about incidents or incident response or those threats that are out there. You really do. And it's also a question of sort of separating out what is. And this goes back to the SolarWinds case that Dave was mentioning and the enforcement actions that are taking place there, but separating out the puffery, sort of marketing puffery around, we have, industry leading security and all these other things from what are you actually doing? And this also ties in, Garrett, with the ESG disclosures and everything else. So cybersecurity is, up to, I think, 30% of your ESG score in some cases. So if you look at some old ESG reports, you see a lot of puffery around cybersecurity statements, right? And the question is how accurate is that? Because that's also a disclosure to investors and to others. So I think it's also that definition too of, when we talk about the incident, and then you mentioned a really good thing, how did you respond to the incident? So did you just have paper processes in place? Like, we had an incident response plan. Nobody knows where it was stored. But we had it, right? Or did you actually know what you were doing, right? The great philosopher king Mike Tyson once said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? That's a cybersecurity incident. And so have you practiced it? Have you actually undertaken the trainings? Have you done these things? Have you walked through your communications plan? Have you walked through your, business continuity and disaster recovery plans, right? And so understanding all those things and being able to separate out those companies that have truly prepared for a cybersecurity incident versus those ones that either have the marketing puffery on their site or just have paper policies in place, I think is a lot of what those type of investor relations actions have been focused on.
Great. Those are all really great points. And I know there's a lot we didn't get to today. The national security exemption is one thing that comes to mind, but in our remaining 4 minutes, I'd love to go do a quick round robin on concluding thoughts, starting with Sarah.
Yeah, the national security exemption will be another interesting topic that DOJ is going to have to weigh in on and see what might be considered national security exemption, which we may not know about, I guess. I think just in closing thoughts, just to follow up on what Mike said is make sure you have your plans in place now. Hopefully you already have a crisis communications plan as it relates to cyber. Hopefully you've already practiced it. But even if you do, you need to go back and dust that off and revisit it, because these new reporting requirements are going to change what your communications timeline looks like. You may need to have, are your IR people involved? Do you have the right people in the room making these decisions and ready to communicate out based on what we know and this new timeline? An 8K might greatly speed up your timeline. It might not, but do you have a plan as to how you're going to get all of these various assets out to your top stakeholders? If you're filing an 8K, do you have a plan to communicate with your customers or top tier clients beforehand? The last thing you want is some of these top stakeholders reading about this in the news. So go back, think about it with this new lens in place, and make sure that your communications plans are reflecting that.
I guess maybe I'll follow up. I think, and it really ties in with what Sarah just said. Companies really need to move away from the idea that this is an IT issue or a security issue. It isn't, it's a company issue, right? Where we see incident responses fall down and where we see follow-on issues arise is when they view it, they haven't thought through the communications issues that come up, the business, the customer contacts that come up, the regulatory issues that come up, and they've treated it as a information technology or just an information security issue, right? It isn't. So being prepared as a company for this, thinking through all of those, not just the immediate impact, the first degree impact, but what are the second, third, tertiary impacts of these incidents? Dave alluded to it earlier. There's a long tail here. Thinking through all of those things in an incident is really, really critical to being prepared. Because if you can respond really well, I think the market will reward that.
Following on that, so new acronyms to learn for this: materiality assessment playbook, MAP; materiality assessment team, MAT. Companies, in order to be ready, not only communication wise, but to make decisions, because the clock starts once you make that materiality decision, right? And you have to make it without unreasonable delay. Thinking about that ahead of time, practicing it, understanding what the outcome of that is important. Final prediction, and this flows into Garrett, we're going to see threat actors shorting stocks and trying to create mayhem based on these rules. And so, that's a whole nother area of risk and concern. And, again, I question sometimes whether these rules have these unintended consequences, whether they're trying to create certainty or whether they end up creating more uncertainty in certain contexts. So Garrett, throw it to you for that last word.
Yeah, I just think from the investor perspective, we often think about an incident happening and investors being concerned about their investment. I think that's only half of it. I think companies are going to expect or should expect a lot more questions from investors in a clear day about what they're doing around cybersecurity. And so my advice would be to take a fresh look at your proxy, at your 10K, the way you're engaging with your investors in the off season, and be more prepared to address these questions with investors, because I think this is where investors will be focusing over the next couple of years.
Great. Thanks, everybody. That brings us right to our closing time. This has been recorded and will be shared with all of our attendees today. I want to thank our attendees, and I want to thank so much our panelists. Thank you to Cooley for joining FTI in this presentation, and we'll hope to speak to you all again soon.